imagine our government had all suddenly said, let's get robustness of human health right up in the next few weeks.
You just gave me an idea. Can you imagine, rather than the lockdown, if they said everybody for 100 days has to just eat healthy?
I would say, Joe, if you got a country and split it in half, right, and 5 million people each, half Sweden, and a couple of months before this virus hits, half of them, they were only allowed to eat fish and eggs and vegetables and, some fruits, not too sugary, and some meat, obviously. They were only eating real foods and they couldn't eat anything else. Within a few weeks, the difference in impact when SARS-CoV-2 is introduced between those two would be enormous.
Welcome to the Spartan Up podcast with Joe Sena, founder and CEO of Spartan Race.
We are talking about overcoming obstacles. The same way we teach people to get over obstacles on the course, we will teach you here on the Spartan Up podcast to get over obstacles in your mind.
Spartans! Joe Sena here, founder, CEO of Spartan and the host of Spartan Up podcast. I got a doozy for you here. This is one that I'm really excited about. It's controversial. I'm sure you're going to be pissed off in some ways, but have an open mind. What we're going to focus on is this guest I had, Ivor Cummins. I found him on the World Wide Web. He sits over in Ireland. He is a biochemist. He's a big thinker. He's done a bunch of analysis over the years for large companies to solve complex problems. I'm not saying he's right. I'm not saying he's wrong, but it certainly got me thinking on what's going on around the world, not just with the virus, but the way news is fed to us, information is fed to us. And look, I've had the fortune during this disaster pandemic over the last couple of 100 days where I've been able to talk to scientists, I've been able to talk to doctors, experts, folks that had COVID, et cetera. And so I've drawn a bunch of opinions and my conclusions. So this was really refreshing just to hear the other side of some things. I think you're going to like this. And no matter where you are on the spectrum, if you're all the way on one side and I'm all the way on the other, one thing we can definitely agree on, there's no way we're going to fight over this one. People should be outside. They should be exercising. They should be eating healthy. If we're outside, exercising, eating healthy, this would be a lot easier to deal with. So let's agree on that and pay attention to this. I'd love to hear from you. If you don't hate it, share it and give me your thoughts. I'd love to hear some comments, etc. I do this for you guys. We are here for Spartan Up podcast. I've got Ivor Cummins, I think I said that right, in Ireland. This guy is a biochemical engineer. He's been solving the world's complex problems for over 20 years in a corporate setting. And he's got a real world reality-based look at COVID. And it caught my attention on YouTube. So welcome aboard. I'm pretty psyched that you're here.
Hey, thanks a lot, Joe. It's great to be here.
What's the story with this COVID thing? Let me just give the world my take. I pissed a bunch of people off very early on in March because I had like a small farm in Vermont, and the way I understood farming to work was, God forbid there was some disease, we would take the at-risk chickens or goats or pigs or whatever, put them in the barn, protect them, and then we would let the disease run loose with the healthy animals. And so I was a bit confused when this lockdown came in March because we were locking up the healthy humans as well as the at-risk humans. Should we not have done that?
Well, yeah, it was the first, I suppose, in the world in a sense. So quarantine by definition is to take people who are sick, symptomatic, significant potential of transmission, and maybe keep them out of the picture until the epidemic curve has passed, and then to allow other people who are unaffected or relatively unaffected to develop natural immunity, without any impacts or death or ICU in that group. So that would have been traditional quarantine. But the World Health Organization for Pandemic Management, November 2019, as late as that, I have the document. They didn't advise quarantine measures or lockdowns at all in the general sense. So really, what happened in 2020 is essentially we copied China. I mean, we can say anything we want, but essentially that's what the world did. So it really was a world first. I would go along more with the WHO and all prior guidelines up until February 2020. That's what I would have tended to have gone with.
And so this was based on any kind of pandemic.
Yeah, again, it's not specified to the absolute letter, but they have a table for pandemic management, a lot of material in it, and that is not recommended. And I think it's because the science has shown over decades that it really is minimal efficacy to try and lock down once it's in society. So essentially in America and Europe, SARS-CoV-2 came in around November, December. The first deaths generally were December. So you've got 3 months with a high or virus, which we all agreed on at the start, traveling with no restraint for a few months. So you got a lot of seeding into the population. And there's an element of dormancy most likely, but we don't have the proof. And then a seasonal trigger occurs, the virus rises, and we see these very sad impacts. But, you know, by around March, to try and lock down and limit people, it just doesn't really make scientific sense. And we now have around 4 or 5 published papers, including one in the Lancet, published, that have done the analysis on the actual data, and there is no real connection between lockdown severity in all the countries and actual mortality outcomes. So we kind of know now from the science, the modeling in February suggested that it would help, but the real world data is now analyzed many times, and sadly, it doesn't make much difference.
And I'm a big believer in health and wellness, and I think there are unintended negative consequences to locking down. Suicidal thoughts, lots of drinking, lack of exercise, kids not going. I mean, I think everybody would agree with me. It's not even a question. The response I get when I say what you just said was, well, take a look at Taiwan. Take a look at China. China's back. Clearly the lockdown works. Look at Mongolia. They completely locked down. They have no issue. How do you respond to that?
So we can pick any number of countries that did severe lockdowns with mandatory masks back as far as April, like Peru and some others, that are now going through the highest mortality in the world. And you can pick countries that didn't do lockdowns and are amazingly low, like Japan, right? But you can pick all day, but that's not science. Science is the preponderance of the evidence integrated together. So that was my whole career. So I know never to get caught out by cherry picking something that fits my favored hypothesis, because it's not scientific. It's unscientific thinking. But that's why we need published papers and analyses like I just described to you, which look at the totality and come up mathematically and say there is no relationship between lockdown severity and mortality outcome.
And so my non-experienced response to that was, well, it's going to come at some point. Like, you can't stop an invisible virus that could last for 28 days on a kitchen countertop. You can't stop that, right? So if you lock down and protect everybody, when you open up, eventually people get it. The response I get to that is, well, then there'll be a vaccine.
So let's look at the vaccine. So generally 6-year cycle to develop a safe vaccine. And this is around 8 or 10 months, and it might be out early next spring. I have a medical director of a large pharmaceutical company who's also a medical doctor. And that person is in our group of 50 plus doctors in Ireland pushing back against lockdowns. But that person made the point that, look, the vaccine is being brought out so quickly for a virus class that they've spent 30 years trying to do this and never succeeded. And it doesn't most likely affect infectiousness. It'll only affect the level of impact on the person from the virus. So it's not going to stop the transmission. And the outcome for the trials to make it successful and pass and be distributed is not even mortality reduction. It's just moving the needle on symptoms in the trial. And the cost benefit, I'd say, for the vaccine, because it'll come for North America and Europe, it'll kind of be a vaccine for last year's epidemic when it comes. So you've got a limited potential to get value as well. So I'm thinking the cost benefit or the number needed to treat, there's guidelines on how much you spend per extended quality life year. And just a quick look at the math with the mortality and where things are at, it looks like it'll be one of the most expensive medications per quality adjusted life year saved, maybe ever. So I don't know. I'm not in any way anti-vax. I got all the vaccines. My family do. I have 5 kids, so I just want to make that very clear. But but if you look at the science, yeah, it's a stretch. It's a moonshot. I mean, I can't imagine it making a big difference. We got to deal with this here and now as it is.
So then your approach would be, not to put words in your mouth, let the thing loose. Protect anybody who's got an issue. Guard them fiercely, but otherwise let it loose.
Broadly, yeah, but let it loose and let it rip are weaponized phrases used by the lockdown kind of proponents. So, but yeah, so I said it very clearly back in March, late March, early April, on my YouTube channel, on other interviews. I interviewed a lot of experts, professors, and all those types. And yeah, for under 65s nominally who are healthy, without metabolic issues or significant risk, because we had the data even back in March, you would say live normally with classic pandemic guidelines, hygiene, distance, stay at home if you have any symptoms, classic guidelines. And then because this looks really worrying and severe, for over 65s or people with metabolic disease, comorbidities, go a further step and do protect yourself. And ideally, the governments, for a fraction of the cost of lockdowns, they could put up a lot of people in 5-star hotels. They could put staff with PPE all over the care homes. They chose not to do that, but they could have for the cost of lockdowns, for a tenth of it, for 100th of it. So that was my attitude. And I agreed with Sweden at the time. Sweden have demonstrated now in the data, if you correct for prior flu season severity and all the factors we know do drive your excess mortality, if you correct for all those factors, now that we understand them, Sweden did the same as England, Ireland, and pretty much everyone else, because the lockdown didn't make any difference, really, like I said earlier.
Even though you and I are in agreement on Sweden, I'm going to give you the pushback that I get that you probably get. The Swedes are a lot healthier than the rest of the world. You've never seen an overweight Swede, so it wouldn't work anywhere else.
70% of the people who sadly passed in Sweden were in care home scenarios, either actual care homes or care at home. And the average age was very high. So I don't think it's so much. We know the cohort who are at risk. And also Sweden, they had a very soft prior season. So they had around 4,000 deaths, less than the normal line in 2019. And then they got like 5,000 and something during the short, sharp corona spike. So, I mean, that factor alone, compared to other countries who had normal prior seasons and then got very low spikes, that's the lion's share, of Sweden's performance. And then there's another team who published 16 reasons why Sweden had higher mortality than the other Nordic countries. 16 reasons. And they go through them in the paper. The top one is the prior season, because that's the big one. But lockdown just gets lost in there.
Again, Swedes are pretty fit.
Generally, but, because the aged are most affected, there's a lot of metabolic disease in the aged in Sweden too. So, but I would say actually, certainly compared to America, I think that's where the point goes. Sweden might get away with a more lax intervention for this problem because they're healthier. So let's say that that's the case and it's fair enough. And I'm sure America or Americans, if they were put in the same size country as Sweden, right beside each other, but yet the differences between America and Sweden health, America would be a lot worse off than Sweden. But you're still back to the question, given that America is going to be worse off because of the metabolic health, you've still got to say, well, what can we do about that? What should we do? And if lockdowns don't really help, it doesn't help you at that difference either. You've still got to decide, what do you do to minimize the impact? And I'd say it would be protecting the most at risk, and we know who they are broadly. You could knock out a risk calculator on the back of an envelope from what we know months ago, and you could give a score for who should isolate.
Yeah.
I'll just give you one example, Joe, just on the lockdown. People just don't realize this. The reason the published science says what I said is because, well, it's just a reality. There's so much data and logic that says lockdown ain't the way to manage this, really. There are better ways.
Does the lockdown just make people feel better?
There's a huge amount of that, I think, to it, because we did something in March. We all locked down 2 to 3 weeks to flatten the curve. We all heard it. The problem was in April, as Ireland's hospitals were emptying out and we were down to like less than 1 death per million people per day coming into May, we were out of the epidemic clearly until this winter. We were going to have 4 or 5 months of nothing going on, but we maintained lockdowns, distancing, and even brought in mandatory masks in July, in the middle of the summer when nothing was happening. And I thought on that day, if you bring in mandatory masks when nothing is happening, how do you ever take them off?
Right.
There is no exit strategy.
So it makes sense to have a lockdown for 2 or 3 weeks if you don't have hospitals set up, you don't have a system in place, you want to protect those workers, get organized. That makes perfect sense. I remember going through Heathrow in March and trying to figure out what was going to happen with our business, right? We got 325 events. I get 10,000 people. Is this going to shut us down globally? And I looked around and I said, there's 20,000 people right in front of me in Heathrow Airport. Nobody's got masks on. None of the TSA, none of the workers have masks on. So it must be okay.
We didn't have masks on during the actual epidemic. And for viruses of this nature, you do not get a second wave like 1918. That was highly likely a different virus, possibly came back from the 1870s. So it didn't hit the old, it hit the younger people. So there's lots of data points to say that that second wave was a once in centuries thing. This one, all of the evidence would say a resurgence in Europe and maybe in North America, Northeast in the winter, but that would be kind of normal. So coronavirus SARS-CoV-2 this winter, all the indicators are saying the winter in terms of excess mortality and ICU loading won't really be much different than prior winters at all. It's just that SARS-CoV-2 will be found on the people who sadly pass and in ICUs. It's kind of the dominant virus this winter. But there isn't a second wave like 18, where the second wave was huge. Essentially, we've had the epidemic. Certain areas of the world, like Israel and Brazil, I mentioned Peru, they're southern tropical type regions, and the virus triggers much later in the year, in our summer. And the south of the USA has behaved like that too, more like a southern tropical like Mexico. So there will be different wave formations. But once a country's gone through its substantial wave and probably hit around 500 people per million passed away, then there isn't going to be a big second wave. It's just the way it works. And that's what we said in April. And that's what's coming to pass. I mean, what can we say?
I've heard that number before. 500 per million seems to be 500, 600. I guess it would depend on the health of that nation.
Oh, yeah. That will very much depend. You could easily go up. There's one country, a very small country, I forget the name, that was 1,200. America, if it wasn't helped by the southern interaction with the virus, could be a lot worse. And in fairness, we saw, I think, let me see now, I get this right. Was it 1,300 or 1,200 in New York state? And I think could have been 2.1 thousand in New York City. And again, that's end of winter, profoundly low vitamin D, a lot of different people of color, who have very profound vitamin D issues, especially in America. And in New York, where there's a lot of intensity and crammed into subways, high spreading, high viral load, and also the treatment, I think it's widely known, was very poorly applied because of ignorance in the New York hospitals with ventilators. So if you put all those factors together, yeah, New York was around 2,100, I think, per million.
That's a big number. So if that were to hold true, although Sweden would be telling us the story, then again, like you said, they're fitter. There'd still be a lot of room to go. Here, you might have answered this. I apologize. If we have masks on, if we've been locked up, if we've basically slowed the spread that naturally would have occurred, the duration just is longer, right?
Yes, if you manage to slow it, it doesn't really gain you anything. I mean, there will be some elderly people and susceptible people who may get more time, but yeah, you at best you push it out somewhat in a small proportion, but mostly you're going to get hit during the epidemic phase. You're mostly going to get hit like you would have got hit anyway, but you might push out an element because the season changes into summer, the virus impact drops, and you might have pushed some people who are susceptible forward to next winter. But it doesn't really make sense because the price you're paying to society and the socioeconomic determinants of health. You mentioned suicide, you got depression, you got unemployment, you got home abuse, you've got cancer diagnoses delayed. We're going to have a big wave of cancer deaths in the coming years. That's invisible blood that won't be on any politician's hands. And I could go on and on. The cost to society of the lockdown is vastly higher than any benefit in human life that's achieved. And I think
I've wrestled with, I didn't live obviously during World War II or Vietnam or whatever, but I've wrestled with how were those deaths okay? And we've gone to a place right now where not one death is okay. So how do you send young people to war and let them get killed, but not, yeah, I'm not getting it.
I think it's been a catastrophic mismanagement, possibly one of the worst in human history outside of war. And it seems like the ideology of lockdown is so entrenched now that they can't get out of it. I mean, I'm looking at the data here and the data is clear as day and multiple published papers. No one's even challenging the published papers I referred to. No one's actually saying that's wrong, lockdown works. No one is saying that. They're just saying we don't want to know.
What would you do right now? You just unlock everything?
Yeah, well, last night we had our Ireland's main TV current affairs program. I've been working with large groups of doctors and legal people and professors in Ireland and internationally a vast amount more to try and counter this kind of madness. And last night we found the media in the last few weeks is beginning to shift. We've actually converted many media people who actually believed this thing and now realize they can see the data. It's like the veil is off their eyes. So we're seeing a shift in the media. But last night, Dr. or Professor John Lee, who I interviewed back in, I think it was May, and we said all what I'm saying now. He's a pathologist with multiple PhDs, and he's an incredible technical guy. And he's been saying what I'm saying since last April. He was on Irish television last night, and he answered that question. He said, personally, based on the science, I would largely open up fully in Ireland, UK, and maybe just keep the traditional flu guidelines. Maybe, hygiene, bit of distancing. But otherwise, Sweden has proven this, right? The data is unassailable. Sweden has the lowest infection and deaths and ICU now practically in the whole of Europe. And their society has been opened up almost completely for over 2 months.
Everybody responds. You got to help me here. Every smart people I talk to immediately respond with, Sweden did worse than the neighboring countries. I know the answer to that, right? Basically, as you said, they had a weak flu season the year before. People that would have died didn't die. COVID caught it up. And maybe they could have protected the elderly a little better. They admitted themselves, they screwed up some of the nursing homes. Okay. But secondly, then they say, well, the Swedes are extremely healthy. They could afford to do that. And then they say, well, the Swedes had a virtual lockdown. The Swedes don't hug and kiss like everybody else does. And
so the rule in Sweden was hygiene and stay at home if you're sick, and keep a 1 meter or 3 feet in restaurants. That was broadly it. Work at home if you can. And sure, a lot of people did, but we know from the published science that it didn't really make a difference. But they were open for business right through the peak of the epidemic. And I have the CNN video to prove it.
And then the other thing I hear is now there's some articles from different areas of Sweden that say, well, maybe they're going to lock down. And so I don't know if that's a smokescreen for every other country in the world that's just upset that here's this one outlier that didn't do what the rest of the world did. And we can't get people excited about that because we don't want that.
And then there's a lot of people who are just embarrassed, like you say. And there's a lot of politicians who find it very awkward. And there's a whole load of drivers for the whole of the world to just not like Sweden because it's shown everyone to be wrong. And that is unacceptable to a lot of different types of people. But what you said there in the last 3 days, I was amused by it. I suddenly saw all over the world's media exactly what you said, that Sweden are now looking at lockdowns. Now, think of how absurd that is. They didn't do lockdown. They succeeded. They got the lowest rates in Europe. And now they're going to do a lockdown. I mean, it's just absurd. So Anders Tegnell, their leader, who's a hero in Sweden, went on BBC Radio 4, no less, British BBC Radio, a day after all that news. And he said, no, he said, that's not true. We'll do local measures, sure, if we feel they're needed. But actually what we're doing is we're opening up the elderly that they can now mix back in society with basic measures. And that's what they did 2 days ago. They're doing the opposite of what all the media said.
By the way, I have business in China that is back and booming. China is back. How is that possible?
It's possible because everything I told you is reality. China had got a severe epidemic wave in Wuhan, but then you had a couple of million people scarpered out of Wuhan and went all over China. But it was kind of like the season had kind of passed, and Professor Michael Levitt, the Nobel Prize winner in chemistry and biochem modeling, Nobel Prize winner, in February, he looked at the Chinese data and he noticed this curve is going up very sharp and curling over mathematically and coming down independent of the lockdown. And he got interested. So he analyzed it all and he discovered to his horror that lockdown wasn't really impacting the curve. And he verified it with the Italian data. Same thing. I've been through this with other experts. The Italian curve turned just like they do, independent of the lockdown measures. So he contacted Ferguson in Imperial College. I think you in the USA have the IHME, similar types of guys who came out with 12 times too high model deaths. They were out by a factor of 12. And Levitt in February contacted the Imperial College and they wouldn't answer him. So he got 2 more Nobel Prize winners to put pressure on them, and he forced an answer. And the answer was basically, go away. Yeah, go away. But he said, guys, you're out by a factor of 12. And that's exactly what they were out by. But he said it back in February. They didn't want to know.
Oh, no, I had 10,000 kids at a race in China 3 weeks ago. Largest event since a lot. Yeah, stuff is back in business. The economy's thriving. All right. So on the one hand, there's a bunch of people still skeptical that are watching this. Ivor is a lunatic. Joe's crazy. So on the one hand, it's a hoax. On the other hand, it's the plague. Where are we?
Oh, yeah. No, we've got to be really careful here. So all we're talking about is data and published science and data from government databases. I never, ever stray from that. So the idea that it's a hoax, I've never touched that with a barge pole. I mean, I've done around 75,000 tweets, I think, of 100,000 followers. I don't have a single tweet where I'd have to say, oh, I said it was a hoax. It's not a hoax. We have all the data. It was a severe virus that caused severe impacts, particularly in elderly and comorbid immunocompromised. We have the data. It was very severe. It was very short and sharp. And it took advantage in a way of prior soft seasons. So you can see across 18, 20 countries, soft season in the prior year and a half, bad hit. Normal season, normal mortality, or a bit of a stiff flu hit, they didn't see much. We have all the data. It's real. It's real. It's not a hoax. The reaction to it is, I don't know, Twilight Zone. The lack of looking at the data and in a balanced, rational, scientific way, discussing the data, in fact, refusing to discuss it, taking people down off YouTube who are not talking about 5G and anti-vax mad stuff. They're just sharing the data, epidemiologists, all taken off YouTube. It's the reaction that's bizarre, you know. I mean, it's no wonder there's conspiracy theorists when there's an absolute refusal to look at the data and discuss it in an open fashion. So that generates conspiracy theorists.
In psychology class, Psych 101, when I went to college, we learned a term called cognitive dissonance. When you believe in something, you are not willing to hear another side. And I think there's a few things going on here. One is there's probably 5 million businesses in the US alone, I'm one of them, that are up against the wall because of this lockdown and the measures. And it would be a disaster if anybody had an open mind and said, wait a minute, the lockdown, we could have gone a different way, right? There'd be 5 million businesses that would want to hang somebody because you've ruined our lives. And then there's probably fear, like, all right, well, if I open things up and more people die, I don't want to have blood on my hands. So that's just lack of knowledge and concern, and that's fair, right?
Yeah, it is. But the problem is there may be torrents of invisible blood, like we discussed earlier, and no one cares for that reason. They only care about the visible potential bit of blood, but no one has any courage. Now, I'd say, because you're US guys, Florida, Professor Levitt and 2 other Harvard and Stanford professors were brought into their parliament or their government sessions around 4 weeks ago. And the governor had a 2-hour session with these top experts who are all on my side, of course. And there's many, many more. I mean, there's literally 42,000 scientists and doctors have signed the Great Barrington Declaration.
50,000. Do you know?
41,000, I think, doctors and scientists, and around 500,000 lay people have now signed. But just back to Florida. So Florida, that guy, the governor, I do zero politics anywhere, and particularly American politics. So I just want to say that up front. I don't even know his affiliations, but he seems like a really smart guy as a human. I'm not picking a political side. He brought them in, and the next day, he took away all the mask mandates in Florida, and he took away basically all of the lockdown stuff. And I thought, whoa, that's actually brave. I agree with you, but it's still brave. And the last 3.5 weeks, I got the US databases. You know what happened to the curve for infections? It didn't even slightest change. And mortality. Literally, you put the line there for when they dropped all the measures, you take it away. There is no signal.
But Ivor, it hasn't caught up yet, they're going to say to you.
No, it's 23 days or so from infection to death. So death should and it can be shorter. So death should definitely be curling up now by dumping all the measures and the masks. Spend the rest of the day giving you examples of what I just said about Florida. In the UK, Ireland,
Georgia, another state. There's been a few states that just, I mean, Myrtle Beach would be an interesting place for you to look, because I was in Myrtle Beach in June, very much like Sweden. There was no masks, there was nothing. And so it would be very interesting to look specifically at Myrtle Beach. Lots of drinking alcohol, lots of hanging outside, doing all the wrong things. And I don't know, did they have a tremendous spike in cases and deaths? I don't know.
Well, the science would say that the spikes will correlate to seasonality, to humidity, to the level of metabolic health, particularly in your aged people, and a whole series more factors, but they won't really correlate to those measures you mentioned. A little, but not much. And we've seen it all over the world, and that's why it's in the Lancet. You know what I mean? I mean, that's the premier journal.
Tell everybody what the Lancet is.
Oh, the Lancet is one of the top medical journals in the world, if not the top medical journal, like with JAM, our British medical journal. And it was published in June. They did the analysis, and I got two German professors of mathematics in Germany published analysis, same answer. We've got Ben Israel in Israel, a mathematics professor, published analysis, same answer. We've got Woods Hole Institute in late April, right? That's US. They did a European analysis, same answer. And University of Oxford Centre of Evidence-Based Medicine did a web publication way back at the end of April saying the same answer. Now, people hear me listing out all of these people who actually analyzed the data. And it all said lockdown doesn't really help. And they must say, but the lockdown guys have their analysis that says it does help. And they don't. They haven't done it.
And so if somebody is worried, they don't want their grandparents to die, right? Their parents to die. You can't blame them. We don't want anybody to die. What do we do? What do we do? What's your advice based on all this data?
Okie doke. So my mother's 80 as well. I told her back when this thing started, don't worry too much because it's metabolic health and yours is excellent. I prefer to be you than be a 52-year-old type 2 diabetic, you know, poorly controlled. So she was fine, of course. And what would I do? I would say that if you're in the midst of an epidemic level experience, like Europe back in March, April, or New York, then a very, very hard applied, people being very careful if symptomatic to stay at home, no matter what age they are, hygiene and distancing, traditional pandemic kind of guidelines. And if you're over 70 in the middle of an epidemic, then really do try and isolate and get the support of your community to deliver your stuff until the epidemic passes, you know, which might only be 4 or 6 weeks. But if you're in a region where you've been through your curve and now you only have a normal winter rise in ICU, that's not much different in ICU and death than prior years, I'd say even the older people, it would be their choice whether they want to be really careful. I mean, it'll always be people's choice. Give them the advice. People don't want grandma to die. Generally speaking, only a small percentage of the population will or ignore rules. Most people in the community don't want grandma to die or anyone. So they'll follow good advice, but it has to be scientific, I think. You see, people don't realize there's a vast quantity of top experts who are fully on my side of the argument. It's just no one got to see them.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
What a shame. Based on this policy, what are we looking like? Like what are you predicting? How are you extrapolating the data? What happens next?
Yeah, well, in terms of scientifically, you know, a winter resurgence is happening in Europe and pockets which were not affected before. Seasonally now, the virus is rising. So we're going to see, I'm guessing what it looks like is a winter similar to prior ones in terms of ICU loading and excess mortality. That's what I expect to see. But politically,
suggesting, maybe you are, that we're going to look like we did at the peak of the pandemic anywhere in the world.
No, if you've been through the peak, the first wave of any new virus hits immuno-naive, it hits susceptible aged, and it causes obviously very sad effects. But once the peak has passed, in a country that has its peak in, say, March, April, May, once the peak has passed, you've got susceptible people have now passed, sadly. You've got community immunity is building up. It's no longer a new virus. So we got T cell, mucosal, we got B cell, we got antibody immunity. It's been through a lot of the population. So obviously the population is much more robust. And you've got seasonal changes. So there's all these things change. All of history, this has been the way. A new virus only gets one big hit. It's like we have millions of years have evolved. The mammalian immune system is just a work of incredible complexity and art. And we've been living with viruses and getting hit with new ones forever.
And we've got the tools to fight it. And there are going to be some deaths, and everybody gets mad when I say that. Joe wants people to die. That's not what I want. Death is
Oh,
death is very sad, but what I would rather see us put all this effort and money towards is getting rid of the Doritos, the Coca-Cola, the drinking, right? I'd rather see people eating healthy. You're a big proponent of eating healthy.
absolutely. Yeah, we have a book, Eat Rich, Live Long, out. Dr. Jeffrey Gerber in Denver. And just on, maybe, I know you want to probably wrap it up, but a final point, Joe, I was just thinking, I interviewed Dr. Ron Rosedale back in early April. Now, he's kind of a genius, and he discovered the importance of insulin and leptin in chronic disease 30 years ago. So he's been a low carb type guy, and he's brilliant. So I interviewed him right at the start of this, and we unequivocally laid out what you would do if you did not want to be severely affected by SARS-CoV-2 virus, and you wanted to have a mild course of disease rather than maybe an ICU. And you could do it within a couple of weeks. He argued even days. And what you do is you drop your insulin, you drop your leptin, you drop your glucose, right? You raise your adiponectin, you get up your magnesium, selenium, and 25-OHD status. And basically, you just do a whole bunch of stuff that we have recommended for years for avoiding heart attacks and dementia and Alzheimer's. It's the same essential intervention, right? You drop insulin and leptin resistance, and you become replete in crucial vitamins and minerals that are part of making the human machine work. And imagine our governments had all suddenly said, let's get robustness of human health right up in the next few weeks.
You just gave me an idea. Can you imagine, rather than the lockdown, if they said everybody for 100 days has to just eat healthy?
I would say, Joe, if you got a country and split it in half, right, and 5 million people each, half Sweden, and a couple of months before this virus hits, half of them, they were only allowed to eat fish and eggs and vegetables and, some fruits, not too sugary, and some meat, obviously. They were only eating real foods, and they couldn't eat anything else. Within a few weeks, the difference in impact when SARS-CoV-2 is introduced between those two would be enormous. Now, you'd want to add getting out in the sun and UV, maybe for nitric oxide, vitamin D, and magnesium, some other key things. But if you did all the right stuff, the curves would be so different. It would just be shocking.
So for me, it's been obvious all along that you can't hide from this thing. And so if there's a state or a locality or a country somewhere, tell me if I'm wrong here, but if they completely prevented anybody from getting it, well, they still got to get it.
Yeah, I'd say preventing it, except for island nations or something, they might suppress it somewhat, but yeah, you're going to get hit later. The susceptible people are not going away. The virus is never going away. It's endemic now. And interestingly, in the US, you can see the Northeast US behaved like Europe with a really sharp rise and very sad impacts. And it's been flat now for months and months and months because they went through it. The South, the virus is different with humidity, UV, and other factors we haven't fully characterized yet. The South kind of went up on a slow hump more in the summer, and it's still persisting. Though, to be honest, it's at around 2 people per million people per day in the US now passing. So it's actually not at epidemic levels by any means. And I'd expect the winter coming, there'll be a resurgence. But again, we have a massive spotlight on this now. Imagine we had no PCR tests for the last month in America at all. I mean, would they know there was an epidemic right now?
Tell people a daily routine that they should be following, like, hey, wake up, work. I don't know if this is it. Work out, eat healthy, whatever it is. So what a day should look like for somebody that wants to survive and thrive during a lockdown pandemic.
I'd say that to effectively reduce COVID impacts, you get your elderly and everyone metabolically healthy, low carb, no processed food, eat real food for a few weeks when you're heading into an epidemic, get vitamin D up, get healthy sun exposure, get magnesium, potassium, get selenium, get your people healthy, and the immune system will do what it was designed to do. And there'll be much lower impacts on ICU. And I think, yeah, I included the path forward in that. So that's probably all of it in a minute.
You're the man. Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it. And let's stay in touch.
Yeah, no problem, Joe. And listen, I apologize in advance for the abuse you're going to get for what I said, even though everything I said is science-based and published and in the literature.